Okay, I think we are going to go ahead and get started. Please continue to introduce yourself in the chat if you'd like. We're so happy to have you all here. Welcome. This is our very first free webinar of 2021 called Barriers for Farmers and Ranchers to Adopt Regenerative Ag Practices in the U.S. My name is Sarah Day Levesque, and I am Director of Regenerative Food Systems Investment, and I want to thank you for choosing to join us today. We are aware that there are other big things going on in the world today, and we appreciate that you chose to spend some time with us today. I promise you this will be fabulous. For those of you who are not familiar with Regenerative Food Systems Investment, or RFSI, we were established 2.5 years ago out of an identified need for more capital to flow into ecological and regenerative production systems, and with an understanding that those production systems can't be truly regenerative if the broader food system they belong to is not also operating in a restorative manner. Our mission at RFSI is focused on two things: facilitating education about investment in regenerative agriculture, food, and fiber, and building relationships and networks that will further the development of this emerging investment opportunity. We address this mission through a regularly curated regenerative investing newsletter, a new print and online industry directory, which is really exciting and we'll tell you more about later, and our annual forum with even more events coming this year. In 2021, among other goals, RFSI seeks to provide more opportunities for dialogue and learning about regenerative agriculture and food, investable opportunities in that space, and the diverse financial and other tools that can help move resilient food systems forward. That is what brings us here today. Jennifer O'Connor is founder of Guidelight Strategies, a strategic consulting firm focused on the design, development, and implementation of strategic funding and program initiatives in the food and ag, environment, and conservation sectors. As the principal strategist and founding director of Guidelight Strategies, Jenny works with innovative businesses, foundations, government agencies, and nonprofits to strengthen organizational capacity and guide them through the development of both their social and sustainability strategies, as well as advising them and implementing strategic funding programs. She focuses her work in the environment, climate change, water, and food and ag sectors, and advocates for systems approaches to solving root problems across these issues. It was early last fall, as I was preparing for our 2021 RFSI Forum, when I started hearing about Jennifer's work through a lot of emails and phone conversations from several people saying, "You need to talk to Jennifer O'Connor. She is working on something big." And she was. It's a project sponsored by Patagonia that led her to conduct more than 150 interviews with stakeholders across the country. The result was an almost 200-page report that outlines 8 barriers to the adoption of regenerative agriculture and ranching and identifies key levers and opportunities for investors and funders to address these barriers. Today, we are lucky enough to have Jennifer O'Connor here to share some of her key findings and answer your questions. We invite you to listen and to submit your questions through the chat function. We'll be sure to collect them and address as many as we can after Jennifer finishes her presentation. And now I would like to welcome Jennifer O'Connor.
Great. Hi, everybody, and thanks, Sarah, for that introduction. I'm just going to share my screen here, so make sure everybody can see that. Yeah, can everybody see my screen? Sarah, is that a thumbs up? Great. Yeah, I'm happy to be here with you guys today and talk a little bit about some of the work we're doing on regenerative agriculture and how we're approaching and looking at the whole system and thinking about the different levers and opportunities to address challenges throughout the system. So for a little bit of background on this work, over the past, I'd really say since 2019, so really more than a year, going on 2 years, we partnered with Patagonia. The real impetus for this report was that the Patagonia team and Yvonne Chenard at Patagonia had received a large tax break from the Trump administration and wanted to put that tax break back into climate solutions. And so I was charged with the set of solutions and looking at regenerative ag in particular as a climate solution. And in part of that process for us was really saying, how do we create a new strategic grant-making initiative, work across all different funding levers within the Patagonia spectrum to address some of the issues on the landscape. So we started out looking at the landscape from a real farmer perspective. That's what we wanted to do, to take a real producer-centric approach to understand the challenges our producers were facing on the landscape, and how do we drive change on the landscape and really transition acreage. That was the real focus of our initial efforts. And over the course of the year and a half, we interviewed farmers, ranchers, activists, scientists, you name it, across, policymakers across the spectrum of the food and ag industry in almost every state, looking at these different issues from a producer's perspective. So in the report, we're looking at the different types of capital that is needed across this space, and some of the places where capital is needed more than others, and where it's needed most, and how do these different levers interact, and how the system, how can we take a really systems approach to this work. So I will go through today just some highlights from the report. I'll set sort of like some of the background information that we go through in the report, just to ground us in what we're talking about when we're talking about regenerative agriculture. And then we'll dive into some of the opportunities and individual opportunities and solutions and levers that we see as really critical in the coming months, years, and especially over the course of the next decade, if we're truly going to realize a regenerative system. So I will just say that, one key thing to sort of ground us in is that there's no one size fits all approach to regenerative agriculture. And so there's no blueprint that is going to address all the challenges on each piece of land. And so that's, really the challenge for us in this space, is to understand that there's a multitude of strategies and a multitude of levers that need to be applied in regionally appropriate context. So we'll get into that today. So just setting some of the background of the report. I mean, many of you might know this, but we dove into a lot of the challenges our current system is causing, and why we need to address some of these challenges. So we know that the current agricultural system is riddled with challenges and negative impacts, and we briefly highlight that throughout the report and analyze some of those challenges at a high level from the conversations we've had and the research we've done in the last year, 2 years. So we know that the current system is fueled by chemicals and fossil fuels. It's fueling both climate change and public health crises. And particularly in our most vulnerable communities, it's having a real impact on rural communities and rural economic viability. And so we're seeing the collapse of rural communities, and food insecurity and food sovereignty. It's having an impact across a multitude of factors. So we'll dive into some of those. And we know that the figures are often debated about the impacts on climate and carbon that our agricultural system has had, but there's no doubt that our current system is contributing to significant global warming, both in CO2, methane, and in nitrous oxide, which are more potent fossil fuels actually than CO2. And these emissions are expected to increase exponentially over the course of the next decade if we continue in this current system. Some of the stuff that I think was really important to highlight, or we were discovering along the way, is that we're really, our current ag system is requiring increasingly more inputs, which are often driven by fossil fuels, to make the system work. So 100 years ago, our farms produced 14 calories of food for every 1 calorie of fossil fuels used to produce that food. And now that is almost reversed. We're also seeing greenhouse gases facilitate a huge loss in topsoil. We're losing topsoil at an alarming rate, 33 billion tons of topsoil from cropland every year, which is windswept, washed away 10 times faster than it can be replenished. So we often hear, and we heard over the course of this process from a lot of different scientists, that on a generous estimate of topsoil left is about 60 years of topsoil left for farming purposes if we continue in this current system. So we're really seeing, and there's a lot of nuance to what's going on in the soil and the degradation of our soils, both from inputs and chemicals, and other agricultural processes that we use in our conventional system or overuse. So a lot of challenges on the soil that we're also seeing. And then we also have historical inequities built into our landscape and how we're approaching the landscape. And we see that especially in land ownership. White people comprise over 97% of non-farming landowners, 96% of owner-operators, and 86% of tenant operators. They also generated 98% of all farm-related income. So we have real equity issues on the landscape that are rooted in historical exploitation of people and land that we have to address. We also have seen that the current system is really impacting our health. This isn't just about climate and soil. This is a human health challenge. We see obesity on the rise throughout the US. We're paying, trillions of dollars to deal with different health-related challenges, much of which can be attributed to the food that we're eating. We're finding our surface water, our well water, our soil, and our rain are contaminated with volatile organic compounds and pesticides and nitrates, all from human sources. USGS last year found 70% of the samples they tested across the US were contaminated. We're finding that the nutritional density of our food and our crops are degrading, sometimes up to 38%, that we've seen sort of the nutritional value and qualities of our crops degrading. And we're finding glyphosate residue in our food samples, as they come to the plate. So we're having a health challenge, and we're seeing it across the board, from water to pesticides in our food, to all kinds of cancer that are being attributed to how we're producing our food, and the toxicity of our food and landscape. We're also seeing that the system is destroying communities in rural America, like I mentioned earlier. Farmers, last year, the CDC did a study, and the farmers were found to be the most likely to die by suicide compared with any other occupation in the US. And since 2013, farmers' net income has fallen 50%. The median income of a farmer, this is profit, was negative $14.49 in 2019. So we're seeing our farmers are always in the red. They're relying on crop insurance and subsidies to survive. And we're seeing that the farmers of color fare even worse, and our indigenous producers and all BIPOC producers across the landscape are faring much worse, with the median household income less than half of their white counterparts. So we have to look at the impacts of our current system and how that's affecting our rural communities. And a lot of these impacts have especially been highlighted and brought to the forefront during this crisis over the last year, especially with COVID. We see supply chains collapsing, places where we have severe food insecurity in the US, and this lack of resiliency in our current system is really being laid bare, and will continue to do so as we face increasing climate challenges across the landscape. So with regenerative agriculture, we have to think about what do we mean when we talk about regenerative agriculture? And I would say over the last year, we had a lot of our conversations with farmers and producers on the landscape and with different activists across the space. We're focused on, like, what do we really mean when we talk about regenerative agriculture? And how do we define this? And while we're not taking an attempt to standardize any set of definition in the report, I'll talk about a few key things that rose to the top when we were looking at regenerative agriculture from the landscape perspective. So the definitions across the landscape vary greatly on what we mean when we talk about regenerative agriculture. Really varies on who you ask. And we've come to define regenerative agriculture through this process as a system of land stewardship that's rooted truly in indigenous land and centuries-old indigenous wisdom, on how we can provide healthy, nutrient-rich food for all people while continuously restoring and nourishing the ecological, social, cultural context of each place. These are not, I think it's important, and we'll get into this, these are not new ideas. Much of this is rooted in very ancient wisdom from land stewards and folks that were working in partnership with the land for centuries, and how they approach that partnership with the land. Some of the, we often get sort of bogged down in defining these specific set of practices that are involved in regenerative ag. And I think it's probably most important to think about the principles behind regenerative ag, since this will vary across the landscape. So when we think about the principles, we are continuing to work with a bunch of different funders and networks across the space, in particular for funders for regenerative ag, to think about what we mean when we're talking about regenerative ag. I think there's also a real challenge across the space now to understand that this isn't, the term and the framing can often be very whitewashed, and we've heard that from a lot of our BIPOC producers across the space. So how do we define regenerative agriculture that is addressing its true origins and roots, and build an inclusive movement and narrative around the word? So we're working on this, like I said, within the Fora group, but first and foremost, especially from all the BIPOC producers that we spoke with, we have to ground these principles in traditional indigenous agricultural mindsets. So RA is not just a set of practices, it is a mindset about how we, and a worldview about how we approach our landscape and our partnership with the landscape, and how we view ourselves as connected to the natural world. So it's as much about that as it is about solving climate. We often are focusing in regenerative agriculture on soil health or climate change, but these are just symptoms of the current agricultural system, and they are sort of the end of the story. And the beginning of the story is just as important. The history of how we've ended up in this extractive system, and how it's increasingly removed from our relationship with land and people, and how it includes the exploitation of land and people in our current system. So it's important to note that making up only 6.2% of our global population, indigenous peoples steward 80% of the Earth's biodiversity, while managing over 25% of her land. Indigenous worldviews are the bedrocks that our agricultural practices and lifeways arise from. And we must ground our practices and principles in these ancestral worldviews and ways, learning from whose land you live on, their history, and how we can support their causes and cultural revitalization on the landscape. So starting with that worldview and that mindset and that bedrock, we can apply a variety of approaches and principles, such as agroecology or silvopasture or agroforestry, some of the words that we hear more used more commonly. These are a set of different principles and practices that, when applied through a regional producer-led design process, we can realize an agriculture system that is expressing the essence of each place. And in one of the key principles of regenerative that we heard across the landscape, especially from producers, is that it needs to express the essence of each place, its uniqueness, its singularity. Not every ecosystem will be the same. So the principles we apply will be applied in different ways across each ecosystem. So each farm differs, the cultural, social context of that place differs, ecological context differs. So we have to look at each place and come up with the regional approaches and localized approaches that work within all those contexts. And if we're able to do that, we can realize a regenerative system that is unique to place, that contributes to a multitude of benefits. Like I said earlier, carbon is often the thing we hear about most, especially in the news or in our politics. One farmer put it to me this way last year, that carbon is the prettiest girl at the dance right now, but there's so much more to consider in terms of biodiversity, water, ecosystem services, equity, rural livelihoods, food sovereignty. So we have to look at this as a multitude of benefits that are interconnected, and we can address climate in some areas, and in some areas we might be talking more about cultural revitalization or resiliency in our ecological systems and biodiversity. We also have to look at nutrient density of our food, the health impacts. So these are all interconnected issues that, when we start to talk about them as interconnected issues, it's much less about one thing. It's about all of the things together. And I think I'll just, highlight in sort of the end of this intro, the background. It's important that when we're addressing this issue, especially from a funding perspective, that we call attention to the equity and justice issues, and regeneration really has to be about addressing those. And it's often, we found across the landscape, real challenges with making sure that that we're centering equity and justice when we talk about these issues. And if we are going to see a system that is truly regenerative, it has to work for all people and be sustainable and healthy and provide sustainable and healthy food for everyone. So we have to address these deeply embedded inequities and racial injustices that the current system has been propped up on. So now I'll dive into a little bit of the barriers. I'll go through each of the key barriers that we identified in the report. And I would say while the report goes into great detail on each of these barriers and the levers to address them and opportunities for funders to engage in different ways, we're going to take more of a 30,000 foot view here of the barriers and the opportunities, and then you can dive deeper into the report. And I also say that you'll see as we go through these barriers that there's a variety of kinds of capital that are going to have to be deployed across the spectrum of these issues. Some of these barriers and opportunities are going to require philanthropic capital. Some may require a blended set of capital to address. Other opportunities will require more investment dollars. So we have to look at the kinds of capital that are needed to address these different issues and where that kind of capital should be deployed. So behavior and cultural change. We started off our journey really understanding that this was a key concept and barrier that much of our, many of the farmers and producers on our landscape are facing. There's a real lack of awareness, knowledge, and or willingness to change in many communities. And so this is a mindset shift that we are talking about. And we can talk about a lot of the tangible things like technical assistance, financing, but there's this intangible mindset shift that we have to really think about and address. Beyond our early adopters and many of our young farmers or farmers of color, this is where the journey begins for many of our producers on the landscape. And we're seeing that there's a real lack of trust towards non-farming communities. There's unclear and inaccessible entry points. There's mental health and community stressors that our farmers are feeling. Lack of access and capital sources only amplify that and really create this inability to implement new ideas without feeling the burden of too much risk. And then importantly, the prospect of losing community respect and strained relationships. That was echoed with almost every producer we talked to, even early adopters, like that feeling of really having to step outside and, farming and ranching can be a very lonely proposition as is, and to feel like they might lose some respect or community relationships is a very challenging prospect. And so we had, a lot of really thoughtful conversations about ways that farmers and folks who are stepping outside of the current conventional system, how they're approaching this, how they came to finally take that leap of faith and make some different decisions. And, to address this, we start with farmers most likely to adopt regenerative ag. Then we often see people working to expand that network out from there and increasing individual capacity and awareness by using networks and targeted language and outreach that is socially, culturally, and ecologically contextualized for each place, engaging with producers, building networks, and then we saw a lot of opportunity for women in particular, places where women are emerging as leading voices in their communities on these new ways of approaching the landscape and production of food and fiber. Those places we're really seeing women emerge as the backbone of the communities and able to bridge these sort of community divides and bring people together around taking these next steps. So that also emerged as really critical across the landscape to engage women in this process. Some of these opportunities that we dove into in this space, groups like Women in Ranching, Women in Farming and Ranching, there's multitude of groups that are working on engaging women and bringing women together to create community and bridge these gaps. Many ranchers and folks we talked to spoke about learning and really engaging in programs like Ranching for Profit that really get at the economic impacts and opportunities for them in transitioning to a new system. There's a lot of amazing organizing groups that are regional and local in context, like Dakota Rural Action or No Till on the Plains, Regenerate Nebraska, that are really working and organizing their producers and creating new community for them to engage and to feel part of something that's going to support them on their landscape, but also bring community together and have a support system. So there's a lot of groups, SAFON in the South, working with a lot of Black farmers in the South, farmers of color. How do we create community and support systems for all these producers to step outside the conventional system? And the next lever that we address in the report is land access. If you are a new producer, young producer, often are producers of color, land access is the most challenging and often the starting place for most people. The USDA estimates that 70% of US farmland will change hands in the next 20 years. And for each American farmer younger than 25, we have 5 farmers over 75 years old. We have a real aging farming population. And with the increase in value of farmlands, and as these current farmers consider retirement, they often find themselves selling their greatest asset, their farmland, to the highest bidder, rather than to future generations of farmers who can't afford that land purchase. It really comes down to the cost of farmland being so high that it is often impossible for farmers and ranchers, indigenous farmers, farmers of color, to get young farmers, women farmers to get started in farming without that, legacy land transfer from family. Not to mention the history of exploitation of people of color on the land and removal from the land. So we have more than half of our farmers operating on rented land, and they're not the decision makers for how that land is stewarded. Often when we're seeing our retiring farmers transfer their land, it's often being bought by the highest bidders, such as developers, or being aggregated into larger farming systems. So we have to really think about our land ownership structures, the land access issues, and make sure that land is conserved in a way that ensures equitable land access and financing for new, young, indigenous, historically disadvantaged farmers to get on the landscape and build long-term tenure on the landscape. 80% of our farmland is owned by non-farming landowners. Most farmers are renting land, is really what that means. So this is a critical constituency, understanding how this land is being operated and owned, and how do we reach this critical group of stakeholders who are the owners of the land, but not the operators. And I think it's important to note we have to connect our new and underserved farmers to the land. Only 2% of our rural land is owned by people of color. So how do we think about this next generation of farmers and ensure there's transfer of land and land ownership opportunities that is equitable? Some of the land access work, we are seeing an increasing amount of groups working on this issue of land access and transfer of land, working with retiring farmers to transfer land. I'll note the agrarian trust, this model creates community-based farm and ranch land ownership, putting land into an agrarian commons that will hold the land to support ecological restorative agriculture and community that can convey long-term lease tenure and equity and interest to farmers. That shares in ecological stewardship and support farm and ranch agrarian viability and build the local agrarian economy. They're really working on building a model to acquire land and put land into a more commons model and get young and underserved farmers on the landscape. This is these kinds of opportunities like agrarian trust, we see opportunity for all kinds of capital into the land access issue. California Farm Link is an excellent example. In California, CDFI that addresses land access, as well as providing all sorts of other technical assistance. Someone like Agrarian Trust, they're a recent example of this work with them is they work to acquire former degraded coal land for new farmers in West Virginia, placing that land into a commons model and reversing this trend we're seeing in West Virginia of absentee holding groups and development companies accumulating land from retiring farmers and doing nothing with it, and possibly for future development. So they're continuing to actively raise all kinds of capital, both investment and philanthropic capital, for these sorts of land purchases and setting up these commons models and these business models for the farmers in those commons, those agrarian trust models. So local land trusts are also a great example in some regions of working cooperatively with landowners to make arrangements for conservations. For conservation that includes agriculture, and making sure that land that was previously acquired or placed under conservation easements continues to be protected. There's opportunity to work with local land trusts to ensure that the conservation of that land includes farming and regenerative grazing and other ag-related specific requirements for the landscape. Black Farmers Fund and other groups, Northeast Farmers Color of Land Trust, really looking how do we create models that do not perpetuate oppressive systems, and how do we build up funding models that include farmland asset financing that can buy back land for farmers of color and help them set up their businesses. So a lot of different opportunities emerging in this space to address land access. And if we get farmers on the land and they're willing to, and their mindset is such that they're willing to look at these kinds of practices that are regenerative in nature, the next barrier that we found was this technical assistance and education. Farmers do not often, farming in and of itself is very, busy, challenging. There's not a lot of free time. The financing structures around them are very restrictive. So they often don't have the resources and time and support systems to learn, plan, implement, test, monitor different practices and regenerative practices on their own. And it's hard for them to apply for government or other kinds of funding to do this, just simply because of time and support needed to do those things. So technical assistance and education programs that focus on supporting and guiding farmers and ranchers as they begin farming or ranching and or as they transition their current land towards regenerative systems are super critical. A lot of the groups that are working on that barrier one around bringing farmers together, creating networks, also do a lot of technical assistance. We're also seeing a lot of funding models emerge where they're pairing that funding, which we'll talk about a little bit later, with really critical technical assistance. Really addressing this barrier is going to require hands-on education programs, follow-up consultations and support on that ongoing advice and assistance, and connecting producers to peers and other networks where they can share learnings, they can be in community with each other, and where they can find consistent support and encouragement. So partnering with organizations that have long-term relationships with local communities and producers can really rapidly, we've seen this across the landscape, amplify the transition towards regenerative agriculture in the United States. One thing that's, we found really critical to note in this particular lever is that there's existing infrastructure that is across the landscape, our RCD and NRCS and Ag Extension. This is existing infrastructure we have that are out on the landscape in every region. In the US, there are 3,000 official conservation districts, RCDs. They're put in place to provide technical assistance and tools to help farmers and landowners manage their land and water. These actors are often highly trusted by farmers. They know these farmers, but they too are lacking the tools and resources, knowledge, oftentimes just the funding and capacity to support, to be able to really support their farmers in transition. So how do we support this existing infrastructure, our RCDs, our Ag Extension agents in understanding regenerative agriculture, the principles, how to apply them in that regionally appropriate context. And young farmers, then this next generation of farmers is also, we see a lot of interest in building out young farmer, next generation farmer training programs. The 2018 Farm Bill provides mandatory funds for young farmers and ranchers, but this program, we see a lot of interest for this program to be expanded and improved, and as well as to develop other funding tools and mechanisms to support young farmers on the landscape. Some of the opportunities we'll highlight here. I mean, there's excellent groups in every state working on technical assistance. And, the list could go on and on forever for this particular barrier. And a lot of these groups need a lot more support and resources to be able to expand and reach beyond early adopters or some of the initial programs that they've been running, and really try to bring in, the new farmers to the fold. And so we see groups like Carbon Cycle Institute in California. They deliver excellent training and education programs that foster carbon literacy among their farmers. They work to network their farmers with policymakers and thought leaders in the public. So there's a real sort of understanding and a transfer of information and knowledge from the farmers to those who are making decisions at the policy level. And they provide technical assistance to farmers in over 30 RCDs in California. Groups like Kitchen Table Advisors also doing critical, business planning, farm business planning support for different farmers and businesses. Quivera's new agrarian program working with young farmers. There's amazing groups, like I said, in different areas like Practical Farmers of Iowa that really are working to understand the issues their farmers are facing, provide them technical assistance when and where they need it. The next barrier, if we have farmers on the land who are getting technical assistance to try some new things, this barrier, financial tools, access to financial tools and vehicles to really support them in transition and de-risk the transition for our producers is huge. It's a really critical barrier. We saw it in every place, whether they're small family farms to larger farms that are trying to adopt new practices. The access to financing, patient, blended, flexible financing for our farmers is really limited. We need to think about providing a financial safety net for farmers and ranchers as they transition their systems, including helping them access assets like equipment, seeds, and land. So this is, really one of the biggest barriers to adoption on the landscape, is that added cost and the risks that are associated with it. And I also note here that, with such high farm debt, which we talked about earlier, farm real estate prices doubling in the last decade, low level of profit for farmers, like I mentioned earlier, the existing financing structures such as farm credit, ag lenders, the insurance, those structures all make it too risky for most farmers to transition. So we would have conversations with producers who understood that they were facing real crisis on their landscape. Their soils were degrading. They were experiencing floods, or pests that their inputs were no longer able to control. They're increasingly seeing a need to step out of the system, that the system isn't really working for them, but the structures around them, financing structures around them are such that the risk is too great. And so we have to think about what kind of financing structures and vehicles can we create to really support our farmers in transition. And especially because regenerative practices or any sort of climate smart agricultural practices will often lead to reduced farm revenues for the initial transition period. And sometimes that can be 3 to 5 years of them transitioning their landscape, weaning that landscape off inputs, trying new things, new sets of cropping, intercropping practices, trying all sorts of things on their landscape to really understand what's going on in the ecological context, and adapt to that and create a system that's going to work for them. So we're seeing a lot of time spent to really in transition, and oftentimes that reduces farm revenues in those initial years. So how do we share this risk? And traditional lenders, our ag lenders, lack the appetite often we've seen to finance the early stages of regenerative agriculture and organic agriculture because the risk ratios are outdated, and understanding conventional practices versus organic practices and recalculating risk based on a new understanding and looking at data of what's going on with different practices on farms will be critical. So what do we need? We need tools to provide adequate access to capital, transition loans, flexible and patient operating loans, guarantee loans, bridge loans. We need tools to mitigate risk, grants, subsidies, equity investments, green bonds, partial credit guarantees by NGOs and banks to compensate for lack of collateral. We're also seeing long-term offtake contracts and agreements with supply chain partners being used as collateral for some emerging financial tools. We need to find ways for funders and investors to partner with ag lenders, with banks and CDFIs and credit agencies to provide guarantees or partial credit guarantees and all grants. All sorts of blended capital tools are on the table here, and we see this as one of the biggest areas for opportunity. And then also important to note that we're seeing a lot of emerging interest in payments for ecosystem services. So looking at how we value farmers on our landscape beyond just profit and yield. How do we look at what they're doing? Say they're providing common good for us all on the landscape. They're protecting our water. They're protecting biodiversity. They're providing healthy food for us all. So we're going to see this come into play, I would say, more and more in climate legislation, especially out of the new administration. We're seeing a lot of interest in how we talk about carbon and soil. I think there's a lot of work that we have to do there to understand how that will be applied equitably and how we can actually uniformly measure soil carbon content when it varies so greatly, even depending on weather day to day. So we also have to look at other services outside of carbon that our farmers are providing us that we should be thinking about, like flood protection, biodiversity, ecological resiliency. And how do we measure those things? How do we value those things as a society? And how do we really support at a national level our farmers for providing all these services for us and for our landscapes? Some of the opportunities, there's a lot of emerging opportunity in this space, and there's a significant number of projects that I'm involved with moving forward on different financing vehicles that I'd be happy to talk about and share in the coming months. But, we see a lot of emerging stuff going on in this particular lever. Folks like Perennial Fund at Mad Ag, they're working with their farmers in enabling them to transition to regenerative organic agriculture using this creative debt structure paired with fully integrated technical assistance, business planning, and access to markets. They're providing operating capital to farmers to forge the 3-year transition gap when they experience that decreased yield that I talked about earlier. So they're offering farmers a 10-year note, beginning with 3 years of transitional operating capital where farmers can pay what they can. And then once organic certification is reached, a revenue sharing structure begins. And then each loan provides up to 2-year deferral to buffer against weather and market variability. So playing with a lot of different structures with their farmers and how they can provide more patient blended set of capital. There's folks like Replant that are also offering new sorts of capital terms for producers and partnering with some major brands in the supply chain. One of their major partnerships, as most people may have seen, is with Danone, working with Danone's producers in transition. They're targeting, over 900 million farmable acres in the US for conversion to regenerative ag and looking at the financing in particular. And then we also see a lot of really, interesting CDFI models, which are more regional lending institutions that are meant to help sort of the local community. And we don't have a ton of CDFIs yet in the US that are really focused on their agricultural community, but there's a really emerging set of outstanding CDFIs like California Farm Link that I mentioned earlier, or Maine Better Harvest Credit Union in Maine, and the Intertribal Agriculture Council CDFI is an excellent example of working with their Indigenous community and Indigenous producers through their CDFI to provide them patient transition capital to support them on their landscape, do what they need to do. So a lot of different emerging models across the landscape on financing, and there's still a lot of opportunity in this space to address the financing needs that our farmers have. And if we give our farmers, the financing they need in transition, the next barrier we talk about in the report is the supply chains. While we're building the supply of regenerative food and working with our producers, we also need to match that supply with adequate demand. Farmers currently are facing uncertain downstream demand and unwillingness to pay more for regenerative products. And on top of this, we have a very centralized system to the point there is a lack of adequate infrastructure and local and regional levels to support regenerative production. So farmers who are practicing organic agriculture or regenerative agriculture, they're facing a complexity of operations issues and processing issues when products are so diversified that we're going to need to see a real systematic reinvestment into the local and regionalized infrastructure that is needed to support a regenerative system, especially in this last mile infrastructure. Processing is a particular pain point. And without the infrastructure, we spend a lot of time with many producers who are doing amazing regenerative grazing or regenerative cropping systems, small family farms doing amazing work where they're having to sell their products into commodities markets if they fail to get it out into to restaurants or direct to consumer or to the other small channels that currently exist. They're having to, if they can't do that, they have to sell the rest of their product into commodities markets that fail to compensate them or recognize their work or products. So we really, we've seen over the last, many decades in this current agriculture system, the real disinvestment in our communities as far as infrastructure and processing. And we need to see a reinvestment in the decentralized processing and supply chain system. So we can look at regional processing facilities, cooperative processing. Some producers like White Oak Pastures, will have the ability to do a more vertically integrated system. Not everyone will be able to do that. So again, it will have to be locally and regionally appropriate. But how do we really build up the processing, storage, distribution channels, and other infrastructure that can aggregate and reduce costs for all? And also I think it's critical, to note that to build consumer demand by institutional procurement is also something that we talked a lot about and saw a lot of interest in across the space. Our institutions, whether they're schools or hospitals, stadiums, universities, they are feeding a substantial proportion of our general population, including many working families, low-income residents, and vulnerable populations. When we look at what's going on in institutional procurement currently, 3 companies, Aramark, Sodexo, and Compass, control over 77% of business into institutional procurement. And they are able to negotiate, as a result, contracts with the industry, including cash rebates that small regenerative producers could never compete with. So we have to look at some of these opportunities like institutional procurement, where we can move a lot of food, and how do we invest in a different system of procurement at this level. Some of the opportunities that I'll just highlight here, and folks working on this type of processing and supply chain, we have folks like Pipeline Foods, which is a great example, working on organic grain processing in a regional context. They're supporting farmers and ranchers as part of that in transition. And they have a farm profit program to increase acreage and financial assistance. And their commercial manufacturing effort is focused on this specialty grain to help these producers they're working with, aggregate and process and distribute across the U.S. So There's models like Pipeline Foods, and groups like Heal Food Alliance that are working on institutional procurement. It's also a group like Other Half Processing. It's not just food, but when we look at the whole landscape of agriculture, fiber, which you'll hear from Sarah Kelly next week, the work that she's been doing, and I've been fortunate enough to help her with on fiber systems in the US, very connected to these issues, because food and fiber are created on the same land. And so when we look at fiber and when we look at textiles, there's groups like Other Half Processing that are working with regenerative grazers and processing, aggregating their hides and processing those hides and working with supply chains to move those hides out into the market. So looking at the other side of grazing, what we do with the hides and how do we create regenerative leather supply chain in the US. So a lot of different opportunities in supply chain. There's local food hubs that we see as really critical, working with their local producers. We've seen in COVID and especially this last year, in California, for example, working with grazers out here, and how do we create community processing, especially for meat packing, so meat processing. How do we mobile slaughterhouses? How do we look at opportunities to really provide more regionally appropriate processing that's better for the producers and also for the workers as well. The next barrier we talk about in the report is strategic communications. We can do all this work to get our producers to build the demand, look at how we build supply, but we also have a communications challenge in this space, and we saw that across the landscape. There's a lot of disparate, as I talked about earlier, understanding of regenerative agriculture, the narrative. There's a lot of mistrust, and we can't really change the system without making sure all the key players and stakeholders, including consumers, have the right information and motivation. So to date, there's been very little media attention or funding being channeled towards regenerative agriculture. And we have, there's a lot of funding that is available in the environment, climate change communities, but funding for agriculture and land-based solutions to climate and to these issues has been really limited. And so we have a real communications challenge that many are seeing as critical to address moving forward. So how do we build shared narrative alignment, developing shared narratives on our landscape that can influence procurement, consumer awareness and behavior and policy decisions. We need more multimedia storytelling. And we also need to support producers in their communications and look at different case studies and amplify the work that's going on in the landscape. Many people across the landscape have heard the stories of 3-4, well-known producers whose stories continue to be repeated. But there's a whole myriad of producers across the landscape of different sizes, of different contexts, both social, cultural, ecological contexts that need to be shared and are yearning to be shared so that they can find different voices and different contexts that apply to them. So targeted communications and the marketing support to our farmers and ranchers and their communities is going to be critical. And we haven't seen a lot of support around communications. And something that was interesting in talking with a lot of producers, a lot of activists across the space, is that the industry and the big ag companies, they spend a majority of their money on communications and controlling the narrative. And so there's a lot of misinformation, there's a lot of mistrust, and consumers often feel very confused about what is actually a sustainable choice for them. We see this happening a lot with meat in the current, with cattle, especially in the current narrative, is that all cattle are equal and they're all bad. And if you just don't eat meat, that's going to solve our problems. And the reality is that our system is much more complex, and there's a lot of very important work that grazers can do on the landscape in the right context and with the right approach. And So this kind of misinformation that is controlled by the industry and major players is really critical to combat, to understand how we tell a system story that consumers can understand. So strategic communications is something we see as a really important emerging opportunity. There's a lot of effort happening across the space with different groups, working on how do we approach the narrative, but we actually need to see a lot more concentrated effort and support in communications. For the group I work with, Funders for Regenerative Agriculture, we're working on a whole set of communications briefs around the different issues, the multitude of benefits that regenerative practices can provide, looking at some of the equity and justice historical issues across the space. So that's one place that funders can engage in the communications working group. There's all sorts of groups like Food and Farm Communications Fund that is working on the grassroots side to provide communications capacity to grassroots organizations across the food and farm space. That's a pooled fund that funders can engage in to really make sure that organizations working across this whole sector have the communications capacity they need to share their stories, talk about their work, engage consumers. Groups like Soil Centric, working to engage individuals and getting involved in this space and finding their unique path and increasing that individual engagement. So where do we really find ways to engage consumers, engage everyone in the narrative, build alignment and shared narratives, and combat some of the industry narrative and the dominant narrative that currently exists? And research. Research is also a critically underfunded opportunity in this space. We need to have qualified scientists coordinate, aggregate, and interpret the growing mountain of data to transform agriculture. Scientists are mostly incentivized, not always, but there's a lot of incentivization in the space to focus on incremental changes to cure symptoms of the system rather than to fundamentally reinvent the system. And a majority of the scientists that we're seeing, even within the USDA, don't have firsthand experience with farming. So we really need to think about the system of science behind our food and ag system. Farmers and ranchers and other technical assistance providers, those efforts, all of the work that they're doing on the landscape with producers can be improved substantially if they have access to the right scientific infrastructure that can support them and promote the practices and aid them in disseminating information that is true and accurate and not influenced in any way by the industry. And we see science as being critical and research being critical to policy. If we're going to change policy in the market, we need to have qualified scientists coordinate, aggregate, interpret this data and transform it and translate it into regionally appropriate and specific recommendations that are relevant to each farmer and to each landscape. So we also see a real need to increase the healthy soils and healthy humans connection. And we saw this as an opportunity in our conversations to really help build consumer awareness. Our understanding of how healthy we are as being connected to how healthy our soils and our landscape are, that connection is critical. And the nutrient density of our food as it relates to how healthy our soils are and how healthy our landscapes are, that's a real emerging opportunity that needs critical investment and support to change not only policy, but to change consumers' behavior. And we have many good institutional research programs as well that are doing critical research in this space that we need to find, those champions and really support their work. There's been limited funding in this space, and it's going to be imperative moving forward. So groups like Bionutrient Food Association doing excellent work on looking at the nutrient density related to particular practices on the landscape and how that's affecting our nutrient density. We have groups like INDIGENOUS Foundation doing really amazing work on regionally specific applications of regenerative practices and how they work. And in particular regions, from almond cropping systems to organic grain systems to agroforestry systems, to regenerative dairy systems, looking at these different contexts and approaches, understanding from a scientific perspective what's working, what's not working, and even just sort of the economic, even evaluating the economic outcomes that are possible from transitioning to regenerative systems. So a lot of emerging opportunities to support research. It's a critical need that's definitely severely underfunded. And then finally, probably the most important and yet most challenging opportunity lever in the space is policy. Without policy reform in this space, we will not achieve the acreage change that we would want to achieve to realize a regenerative system. And much of our land, especially in the heartland, is really dictated by crop insurance and subsidies that are skewed to very large corporate farms to grow corn, wheat, soybeans, and confined animal ag systems as well. And so, public policy shapes almost everything about the ownership and management of our landscapes. And they can tip a system towards transformation, or they can create barriers to transformation. The Farm Bill is the current, is the major piece of ag legislation that we have. It's passed every 5 years. It doles out nearly $1 trillion every 10 years in farm subsidies. Over a third of those subsidies go to corn, crop insurance for corn, as well as supplemental nutrition assistance programs. And then much smaller amount of funding goes to on-farm conservation programs, which are managed through the NRCS. The most recent Farm Bill in 2018 expires in 2023. So that's our next opportunity in the space to change the Farm Bill. Our current policy, in summary, our current Farm Bill makes it so citizens really have to pay. And the best way to summarize it is we're paying 3 times for our food. We're paying at the checkout, we are paying in environmental cleanup and medical costs, and we're paying as taxpayers to provide these subsidies and insurance to a failing system. Example of this, to put it in context, in 2019 in the Northern Plains, in areas like Iowa, Nebraska, there was extreme flooding that occurred, and their wetland ecosystems and soils have been degraded to the point around their ag land that most of the conventional producers lost their crop that year, most of that corn and soy. And so there was a huge amount of prevent plant claims filed. And so we, the taxpayer, paid for that lost crop. However, the small diversified farmers working with groups like Regenerate Nebraska or through other groups like Practical Farmers of Iowa, we found that a majority of them did not lose their crop. And yet the taxpayers, we are paying for a system that's really unhealthy, and unhealthy to the point that they can't withstand heavy rains. And so we have to think about this crop insurance in our farm subsidy system, and how do we reform it? According to a lot of the groups working in this space, like Meridian or other groups working on crop insurance and looking at the risk, crop insurance is dictated by these risk management ratios. They're finding that the models are off by up to 200%. And so these models of establishing crop insurance based on these risk ratios are based on very old agricultural data, and they do not adequately compare conventional versus conservation or regenerative practices, which we need to do in order to recalculate the risk ratios and recalculate how we're providing insurance and support to our funders. And so there's a huge need to experiment and evaluate on policy tools that will help our leaders and governments have the evidence they need to implement new actions for climate mitigation, climate adaptation, rural economic development, habitat protection, food security. There's a lot of really critical movement building and organizing going on in this space. And we need to continue to do that base building and movement organizing around agriculture, similar to what we've seen happen in a lot of the fossil fuel space and coal. we need to see that kind of organizing and collaborative campaigning going on and base building around our agricultural industry and the changes that we need to see on the policy front. So much of the policy work is very nascent. It hasn't got as much attention. And part of that is that, we don't have a lot of progressive legislators who have championed these issues because it's often been seen as not their constituency, not their issue set. So we need to build progressive legislative support to at state and national level to really build champions for this work, to transition crop insurance on the state and local level, to build healthy soils and water policies that are tied to agriculture or cover cropping, look at all the funding mechanisms at the state level that we have possible that we can tie to agriculture. We're seeing interesting stuff happen in states tied to water, as opposed to really doing expensive water cleanup and building, new facilities to try to clean our water. We've seen a lot of states, upstate New York did this to really in the Hudson to say, to look at upstream that our farms and the inputs and toxicity on those farms were causing a lot of the water pollution. So if we address the agricultural issues and tie water policies to those, that we can actually clean up our water for much cheaper than having to mitigate toxic pollution in our water. So that's, those kinds of things when we're looking at this from a holistic perspective on the policy side. And like I said, advocacy and movement building, this community organizing and building statewide advocacy work, national networks of advocacy groups, shared narratives, shared campaigns, as we move towards the next Farm Bill. A lot of groups are working on this. State Innovation Exchange, for example, is helping, or they're focused on working with progressive legislators. So they have a progressive legislator agricultural cohort that they're building. That they started this last year to have a cohort of legislators that are understanding regenerative agriculture and issues on the landscape and able to speak to these issues at both the state and national levels. Young Farmers Coalition, working on really building young farmers to get involved in policy. They're building a fellowship for young farmers to take local policy offices. So really supporting farmers being more engaged, especially young farmers, in policy. Like I mentioned earlier, groups like Meridian Institute and Land Corps are two groups that are focused on some very critical national level policy issues like crop insurance and recalculation of risk for how we insure our farmers, and engagement of transition team and with a new administration, how we're going to look at agricultural policy moving forward. At the state level, National Healthy Soils Network, which really came out of California's work on healthy soils, and now building this national group of healthy soils, state level policies. So a lot of different work going on to support policy. And the reality is, in the policy side in this space, we have very few funders that are deeply engaged on policy. So we need, as a funding community, to build up our funding for policy. And one place to do that, there's a working group within FORA, Funders for Regenerative Ag, and within SAFSF, which is Sustainable Ag and Food Systems Funders. Both groups have policy working groups that are diving deeper here on how do we create some collaborative grant making strategies, build networks, support our advocacy and movement leaders on the ground to address some of the short-term and long-term policy challenges. And then I'll just, wrapping up, we dive into some other, like I said, issues in the report. But I think it's critical here to note that, like I mentioned earlier, there's a variety of issues, as you can see, that we've just gone through. These barriers and these levers are all very interconnected, and we can address financing, but then we're going to also have to address policy. Then we can address land access, but then we need to address policies involved in that too. And so is financing. They're all very interconnected, and it's almost impossible to separate any one of them from the other. And so what it's going to require is a very diverse set of capital applied to these issues. And one of, so there's a multitude of ways that we're looking at funding, and we chose to approach funding not only for Patagonia, but for other funders that we are engaging with on how to address these issues is regional approach. So looking at each context and each place is going to have its own needs as far as each of these barriers. So how do we address some, look at some regional approaches, understand all the different players in that particular region, and what kind of capital then is needed to help move all of these levers forward in a particular region. We need blended capital. So all kinds of tools can be at play here, in addition to grant capital. So investment capital as well to help transform our food system. We need to make sure when we're talking about funding, we're incorporating equity and justice into how we're approaching our funding systems, ensure that funding addresses these historical inequities that we talk about in the report. Some of that might look like participatory grant making, inviting our producers and our community stakeholders to help set priorities and develop strategies. We often talk about what needs to go on in our landscape, but we often don't have farmers, ranchers, communities who are engaged on our landscape part of the decision making. So how do we set priorities and develop strategies? Have these folks sit on boards or advisory committees, peer-led grant-making panels, be part of investment committees. How do we think about creating a more participatory structure on the funding side? And then multi-year funding. If we're going to change the system, we're not going to get there in 1-year grants or, or short-term funding. Most of the funding we see moving into this space is very short-term. So we need to think about multi-year collaborative systems-oriented funding that allows producers, organizations, nonprofits, activists, to respond to the opportunities and work together and build the capacity we need to hopefully eventually change some of the bigger barriers like our Farm Bill in the future. So I will stop there, and I think Sarah, hopefully has been monitoring for questions, and we'll have some time for question and answer.
Absolutely. And first of all, wow, thank you so much, Jennifer. I told you guys this would be fabulous. I have way too many questions, but also a thank you to our attendees who are full of questions and conversations. So I'm going to get to these as quickly as we can. So I'm going to bounce around a little bit, but I want to start with, you mentioned that we have very little funding to regenerative specifically, like it's going to climate change. But one question is, what do you see as the needed narrative to help climate-focused funders or investors understand the importance to include and focus, on underserved and BIPOC farmers?
Yeah, so, well, it seems like there's 2 points to this question. Maybe I'm hearing it wrong, but one is climate-focused funders have not in any sort of major way even engaged in food and ag to start with. So we have one challenge there, that is getting climate funders to engage in the food and ag sector and seeing it as a climate strategy. I think there's a challenge there with narrative because we see a lot of climate funders hesitant to engage in this area because there's so much internal debate about carbon mitigation potentials. And there's internal infighting about, well, is regenerative organic or non-organic? There's a lot of this infighting that goes on, and often climate funders feel like they just don't know enough and there's too much unknown. And so, we talk to climate funders, that's often what we're hearing. And so I think needs to be a lot more education about this set of solutions as being, yes, there are opportunities to mitigate carbon. It's going to vary from ecosystem to ecosystem. We can argue over the minutia of like how much, but while we argue about it, we do know that our current system is having exponential impacts on our environment and climate. So we know we have enough information to know we need to address the system. And then on top of that, we have to stop being myopic in our narrative that it's just about soil and carbon. It is about a system of agriculture that has a multitude of negative impacts beyond carbon, and it affects our biodiversity. It affects our communities. It affects our health, and we also affects the. We also have to look at the equity and justice issues that are rooted in that food system. So, when we often are talking to funders and people across the space, I think a critical piece of the narrative and the understanding of these issues has to be that the more that we can stop trying to just silo this out into one issue, and we can talk about the connectivity of all of these issues, and that includes historical exploitation of people and land, and the inequity and the historical racism that's involved in our food system that has gotten us to this place. I think we have to talk about these issues together, and so we saw that from most of the producers that we spoke with, is that they don't want to just talk about carbon. They see a lot more happening on their landscape than carbon, and so I think that's one of the things that we have to get better at, is not trying to pigeonhole this into like, okay, we're just going to talk about soil health or carbon or this. It's all of these things together, and they can't be disassociated from one another. So that's what we, have been trying to focus on with funders in the space, and engagement with climate funders this is beyond just climate mitigation. It's resiliency and adaptation across our landscapes and our communities. And we can draw down climate in some places, but we also have to think about creating resiliency.
Absolutely. And I want to stick with this theme of the narrative for just a moment with another question. And this person said, a big concern of mine is the co-opting of the term by Cargill or other firms, as well as conventional farmers calling themselves regenerative without standards about how they are using herbicides or pesticides. This is a huge debate, and I know you'll have opinion, and others in this call might have different opinions, but do we need a standard for regenerative practices for farms, maybe like SASB, ESG for public firms?
Yeah, so this is it's a hot topic of debate, and it's a good question, and we talk a little bit about it in the report. There is definitely a place and a need for, especially for consumers, I'd say we've seen it come up more, to understand and know that what they're getting is what we say it is. I think there's definitely a place for that. We chose very intentionally not to dive too deeply into certifications, just because there's all these other barriers that I just went through, that before we're even really going to get to a place where most of our producers could certify to any of this, we have all these barriers to address, and just fundamental barriers to even get them to a place. And when we look at certifications in the space that are very aspirational, something like regenerative organic, that's a very aspirational set of standards. The reality on the landscape is maybe 3-4 producers, can, at the current juncture, a handful, maybe we get to a dozen, could meet that standard. I think it's hard to, if you're out on the landscape talking to corn farmers in the heartland, like starting off with organic for them, that might be a really big hurdle. And so we have to think about ways that we can put producers on this train. I often talk with Tim Maples, or Tim Josephs from Maple Hill Creamery. We talk about this in the Grass-Fed Alliance. Like, we have to get people on a train of understanding how to understand their landscape and the context differently. Maybe that's no-till. We see that happen. We see that resonating better in the Northern Plains and the Midwest, and the Heartland. Maybe it's organic. That's, we're seeing that being an easier conversation on the coasts. Maybe it's a whole different conversation in our rangelands. We're seeing a lot of that for example, in working with Mad Ag in Colorado, they're working with ranchers out there. It's a whole different set of constituents who are very conservative. So they're working on, they're framing it as freedom farming. Okay, like these guys are taking all of your money, you're paying all these inputs and you're making no money. Let's talk about the economics of it. And then these guys are like, oh yeah, guys and gals, I should say, who are ranching are like, yeah, let's do this freedom farming thing. You know, the narrative is so, it's so unique to place and social cultural context at the current juncture. So there's so much happening in these different areas where different approaches and different applications of regenerative are going to have to be applied, that right now I think it's more imperative that we focus on a set of principles and apply those in a regional context. And then, you know, we get to a place eventually where we have the infrastructure, we have the support for our producers, we have a good blended set of capital structures that they can transition. We can think about how they would reach an aspirational certification. I mean, even with Patagonia, there's a real realization with that certification that, you know, it's that we can't spend a ton of time on that right now because we just need to get farmers. It's going to take maybe 10 years to get enough farmers to a place where they could actually certify to something like that. So I think it's a complicated issue because there's certainly a place for certification. It might be a while before that's where we need to focus our time and funding, just because we're so far removed from getting there. And a lot of people have done a lot of great work on organic certifications over the years. And, you know, even that's really been hard to adopt. And we see only, 4 or 5% of the market, and a lot of confusion for consumers around labeling. So, you know, I would focus personally more of my time and attention towards getting producers moving on the train in whatever way we can engage them. Then eventually we get towards the end of that train, we might think about the right certification.
Yeah, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And in our teams, we often talk about it being regenerative, being a journey and not a destination, and really focusing on what you're saying, which is really like, let's get more farmers on the journey before we move forward. The next question related to this, I think, and there's some commentary that comes before it, which I will read, which is changing agricultural practices will impact the supply chains of $1 trillion economy. The multinational food companies have created a complementary, vertically integrated system from seed, breed stock, to farm, to processor, to retailer, to enable farmers to use cover crops, rotate their crops, use crops and seeds customized to their specific soils, climates, water, socioeconomics. They need markets to sell into. It seems like the direction of the industry is going with bio-coated seeds and continued row cropping practices is counter to regenerative organic matter in the soil. Are there conversations underway to address these disparities? And I think that's to you and maybe to our audience too, if they know of any coming in and having those conversations.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'd be happy also to hear from the group on, ways different people are addressing different disparities and issues on their landscape. I mean, there's a lot of these sorts of, I think one thing that's why we mention research and data and science in the report. We just need a lot more support to understand on the actual practical implementation type research of how we can apply to these different principles in different contexts. And so that's where I'm really looking to folks that are working on that, looking at our different cropping systems, what's working, what's not, and how to apply these regenerative principles in these contexts. And I think there's still just a lot of work that needs to be done there to see like how different cropping systems are appropriate or not appropriate, depending on soil type, depending on ecological context. And, we just haven't had a lot of support for as much support. I mean, certainly people out there are doing really, good work with what they have, but enough support to really, dive into some of these very minute details about the kinds of cropping systems that are actually going to work or would be truly regenerative and or not. So happy to also, hear from others on what they've seen.
Yeah, so I think generally that question for those of you in the audience, if you want to comment, is where do we see the direction going when we see a lot of these? I think this person used the bio-coated seeds, but and using it in continued row crop practices. But where do we see the direction of this going? And that can be a conversation to carry on, but I will get to the next question.
I'll also just note that we do talk about seeds in the report, because I think it's a critical conversation, and just attempt to highlight folks who are working on preserving seeds, and how we think about seeds moving forward, and not bioengineered, that sort of tension of bioengineered food and tech as opposed to natural solutions.
Right. That's great. And we'll try to include I included the link to the report in way up here before our conversation really got going. But we'll include it again, and we will include it in the follow-up email, so you all can make sure that you go back and either reread or read that report from Jenny. Okay, I love this question, especially for this audience. What are your main recommendations for investors and farmland owners who want to make a reasonable profit while also doing social good?
Okay, well, I mean, this is going to depend on your business. So profit's going to be so varied depending on the types of system that you're in. Are you, are you in sort of a multi-crop system, or are you an agroforestry system? Are you grazing? It's all going to be very varied. I'd say the people that do the best are those that are looking at it from sort of a vertically integrated standpoint. Like, what are they producing on the landscape? So what different markets can they move products into? How can they look at whole plant and whole animal approaches to what's going on in the landscape? Where are they producing fibers or food or other materials that can go into other markets? How can they look at the whole animal? I mean, let's look at grazers. We have so much value being lost on our grazing land because we're not looking at the whole animal often, and they could get huge value for their hides. I mean, Sarah's going to get into some of this on leather next week. How do we look at the whole animal approach and really ensure that what we're doing on our landscape, we're diversifying our markets. So we're not only resilient on the landscape, but resilient in sort of the marketplace and what we can move and where. And some of that is going to require investment in infrastructure. And hopefully that's where we're going to see some more systematic investment. Hopefully maybe even eventually from a national policy standpoint, we'll have a reinvestment so that producers can process, aggregate, and distribute a diverse set of products. But that's where we're seeing success, is where people have really thought about diversifying. And if you look at all of the, big guns in this space who have been very successful, like Will Harris or, Gabe Brown, they're the stories we hear a lot, but like those guys have very diversified portfolios of what they're doing and business plans on their landscape. So, you can start with a few things, think about a set of things that will work well together for your landscape, but that'll also provide you some resiliency in your business, and direct to market to, you got to have all sorts of things. We see that in COVID, all these grazers are really adapting. The grazers group I'm on in California, they're adapting super quickly to like moving their product in a multitude of ways and more cooperatively. And that's been very useful.
Awesome. Well, I hate to say it, folks, but I think that is about all we have time for today. Thank you again, Jennifer. That was incredibly awesome. Thank you all in the audience for joining us and for asking all these questions and for all the great chat. We'll keep the line open just a little bit longer after I finish a few things here, and then you guys can kind of scroll through and get some of those links. We'll also work to summarize this and include this in a summary email, and you will have access to this video afterwards, and make sure you get the link to that as well. So thank you again, once again, Jennifer. I hope you all are walking away here with your minds full of the opportunities that lie ahead. We're not quite through yet. I would like to take the opportunity right now to invite you all to join us again next week at the same day and time for another regenerative dialogue and another deep dive into the opportunities for investment in regenerative agriculture. Next week's webinar will feature another fabulous report, the Fibers Roadmap, Integrated Capital Opportunities to Support Revitalization of U.S. Grown Fiber, Textiles, and Leather. This program will bring together one of the report authors, Sarah Kelly, who was actually on this call today, to share a unique collaborative model for investing in the regenerative fiber market, along with 3 entrepreneurs who are featured in the report and who will share their unique opportunities for investment. You are sure to learn a lot again. And so if you haven't already, please visit our website, www.rfsi-forum.com, to register for that one. If you are interested in supporting a future Regenerative Dialogue webinar, we do have sponsorship opportunities available. Please feel free to email us for more details or to provide ideas and feedback for future webinars. We can be reached at info@rfsi-forum.com. And for those of you who are wanting to dig even deeper into this education in regenerative agriculture investing, if you missed our 2020 Regenerative Food Systems Investment Forum, which included 4 days of educational presentations and conversations, we do have it available on demand. And for this month only, we have it available for 25% off. So please use the code GRATITUDE at the link shown on the screen here. And I think my colleague will also drop it into the chat for that. And finally, if you'd like to just stay in touch with us and with the investment space and those participating in it, please sign up for our bi-weekly Raising Regenerative newsletter. And please visit our new Regenerative Agriculture and Food Investing directory, which is on our website, to find partners and solutions for your operation in this space. Again, both of those can be found at rfsi-forum.com. So yeah, thank you one last time to Jennifer O'Connor. Her work here is amazing. Please go visit her report, take a read of it. And we look forward to continuing to bring you great opportunities to learn here and to connect. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Jennifer.